My stepdaughter called me a gold digger at her father's retirement banquet. Then the employees opened the payroll ledger. My stepdaughter called me a gold digger while her father sat 6 feet away, trapped behind a mouth that could no longer keep pace with his thoughts. Claire stood beneath a carved walnut sign that read, Whitaker Furniture Works. 4 generations of craftsmanship, one hand resting on the podium and the other wrapped around a champagne glass she had barely touched. Nearly 90 people filled the showroom that evening. Factory workers sat beside suppliers and local bankers. Family friends occupied the tables closest to the stage. A slideshow behind Claire moved through photographs of her father inspecting lumber, shaking hands with customers, and standing proudly beside finished dining tables. They had come to celebrate Daniel's retirement 7 months after his stroke. Claire had arranged every detail. Even the centerpieces had been made from walnut scraps collected from the factory floor. Dad built this company through discipline, sacrifice, and loyalty, she said. He protected it through recessions, foreign competition, and people who saw a family legacy and mistook it for an opportunity. A chair scraped against the concrete floor. Then Claire looked directly at me. Some people marry successful men and assume proximity entitles them to ownership. There's a simpler word for that. She paused. Gold digger. At the table beside me, my stepson Evan lowered his eyes to his untouched plate. Daniel's right hand moved against the armrest of his wheelchair. 2 fingers lifted, fell, lifted again. Since the stroke, he tapped when he was frustrated or trying to force a word into the open. His lips moved once, but nothing came out. Claire continued as though she had not noticed. She announced that I would no longer have any role in Whitaker Furniture. A buyer had offered to take over the company, preserve the family name, and remove what she called personal claims that never should have existed. Those claims belonged to me. 9 years earlier, I had put almost $400,000 into Whitaker Furniture when the company was days from missing payroll. For 8 years, I had worked there without collecting my salary. Claire had decided those 2 facts proved I had spent my marriage positioning myself to take her father's company. She never asked why the debt had not been repaid. She never asked why no paychecks had ever reached my bank account. She did not ask why every surviving record showed money moving from me into the company rather than the other way around. By then, questions would have interfered with the story she preferred. Near the back wall, Ruth Ellis stood beside a display table covered with old catalogs, employee badges, family photographs, and 6 thick payroll ledgers bound in faded red cloth. Ruth had been the company's accountant for 23 years. She was small, silver-haired, and rarely raised her voice. That evening, she wore reading glasses on a chain and carried a canvas bag filled with copies. Miguel Alvarez, the production supervisor, stood beside her with his hands folded across his tie. Claire lifted her glass. To Dad, she said. And to returning this company to the family that built it. Ruth opened the first ledger. Its spine made a dry, cracking sound that carried farther than Claire's microphone. She turned several pages, found the year she wanted, and laid the book flat. Before anyone drinks to that, Ruth said, the employees would like the payroll record read correctly. Claire stared at her. Ruth turned the ledger toward the nearest tables. 8 years of my life were written inside it in black ink. No paychecks, no bonuses, no distributions. Only my name, week after week, beside the same 3 words, deferred by agreement. Daniel looked at the ledger. Then he looked at me. To understand why everyone in that room trusted an old payroll book more than the woman holding the microphone, you have to understand how long my husband and I had allowed the wrong story to stand. I met Daniel Whitaker when I was 36 and working in hotel procurement. He supplied custom furniture for a renovation project I managed. Our first conversation became an argument over a rejected shipment of walnut veneer. Daniel drove 2 hours to tell me wood was not printed wallpaper and grain could not be controlled. I told him variation was acceptable. Ignoring specifications was not. He studied me for a moment. You're difficult. I'm the customer. That's not a denial. He replaced the shipment. 2 weeks later, a small cutting board arrived at my office, made from the rejected veneer. A note attached to it read, "For the difficult customer. Grain pattern uncontrolled." That was the man I married. Proud, but capable of laughing at himself. Practical. Attentive without making a performance of it. Daniel was 49, widowed, and raising 2 children. His first wife, Marianne, had died 3 years earlier. Claire was 20. Evan was 17, I never tried to replace their mother. Evan warmed to me, because we both cared about how things were built. Claire remained courteous but distant. The first time she introduced me to a friend, she said, "This is Laura. She works with Dad sometimes." Daniel heard her. He kissed the side of my head. "She does a little more than that." At the time, I thought that was enough. We married at the courthouse with Claire and Evan as witnesses. For several years, the family worked in its imperfect way. Claire finished business school and moved to Charlotte. Evan studied industrial design and later joined the factory. Daniel and I built a life that felt steady. I also kept the small bungalow I had bought after my first marriage ended. It was the first home I had ever owned with no one else's name attached to it. Daniel told me it was wise for a woman to keep something that belonged to her before marriage. Years later, that house became the first thing I gave up to save what belonged to him. The warning came through a phone call Daniel did not know I answered. I had stopped at the factory to bring him lunch. The office was empty when a supplier called asking when Whitaker Furniture planned to pay invoices that were 92 days overdue. That supplier had worked with the Whitakers for almost 30 years. I found Daniel on the production floor, laughing with Miguel over a stain sample. Carolina Hardwood called. Daniel opened the lunch container. "I'm handling it. They said you missed 3 payments. We lost the Beaumont order. Cash is tight. The Beaumont hotel contract was worth nearly $4 million. Daniel had told me it was delayed, not lost." 2 weeks later, a finishing machine disappeared from the factory floor. Daniel said it had gone out for repair. Miguel mentioned that the leasing company had taken it. That evening, I placed 3 vendor notices on our dining table. "How bad?" Daniel stared at the envelopes. "We can make payroll twice." And after that, we start choosing who waits. There were 74 employees. Some had worked for the Whitakers longer than Daniel and I had been married. Their Friday deposits paid mortgages, prescriptions, tuition, and groceries. What do Claire and Evan know? Nothing. They own part of the company. Claire just got promoted. Evan finally has a design line going into production. I'm not telling them their mother's company is about to fold, because I misjudged one contract. He called it Marianne's company. That told me what frightened him most. It was not only bankruptcy. It was being remembered as the man who lost what his first wife had helped build. I took leave from my job and began helping at the factory. I renegotiated supplier terms, persuaded 2 hotel clients to pay early, and cut every expense that did not keep the production floor moving. It bought us time. It did not close the gap. 3 months later, the final bank rejected Daniel's request for more money. The company needed several $100,000 before the next payroll. My bungalow had increased in value. I called a realtor. When I told Daniel I planned to sell it, he stood so quickly his chair scraped the kitchen floor. "No, we need the money. That is your house. It's an asset. It has nothing to do with me. And right now, it can keep 74 people employed." He walked to the sink and placed both hands on the counter. "What if the company still fails? I lose the house." "I know. And you lose the factory. That isn't what I'm asking." He wanted me to promise I would not blame him. I should have demanded that Claire and Evan be told exactly where the money came from before I transferred $1. Instead, I placed my hand between his shoulders. "We'll make it work." The bungalow sold 3 weeks later. I remember standing in the empty kitchen after the closing, looking at the pale square where the refrigerator had been. That house had held the first life I built, without depending on a husband, a parent, or anyone else's approval. Almost every dollar from the sale went into Whitaker Furniture before the next payroll. The company lawyer offered to protect me by giving me the right to take shares if the money was never repaid. I refused. Those shares had belonged to Marianne. After her death, they passed to Claire and Evan. Saving their father's company was not going to become the reason they lost what their mother left them. Daniel promised he would explain that himself. Instead, he told them the company had found emergency family financing. Then he left out the part showing what I had given up. I knew he had not told them everything. I let it go, because the factory was still fragile, and Daniel said the truth would be easier once things were stable. The company became stable. The truth did not become easier. I left my procurement job and joined Whitaker Furniture full-time, because the business could not afford someone to manage operations. Ruth placed me on payroll. I deferred every check. At first, I expected to wait 6 months, then a year. After that, waiting became normal. So did being overlooked. At first, Daniel said we had saved the company together. Later, A trade magazine credited him with using personal assets to protect the workforce. At a chamber dinner, he accepted an award for preserving local manufacturing jobs and thanked the employees, the bank, and his family's patience. He did not say my name. On the drive home, I asked why. It was a short speech. You thanked the bank that rejected us. They later helped with equipment financing. You thanked people who risked less than I did. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. Do you need me to announce to the county that my wife sold her house because I failed? That was the first time he said it plainly. He was ashamed. I understood that. What I did not understand was how easily shame can become permission. Claire eventually returned to Hickory as Vice President of Business Development. She was intelligent, polished, and deeply invested in the idea that her father had rescued the company alone. If I corrected a figure in a meeting, she called me good with paperwork. If I made an operational decision, she described it as helping Dad. Daniel reduced the problem to one sentence. She'll learn. But learning requires someone to tell the truth. No one did. Evan noticed more than Claire. One night, he found me working late over shipping schedules. Why do you keep doing this? He asked. Because your collection is 3 days behind. That's not what I mean. Why do you keep carrying the place while Dad and Claire act like you volunteer here? I closed the binder. Your father will explain when he's ready. Evan leaned against the doorway. I think ready is his favorite place not to arrive. Then Daniel had the stroke. Miguel found him in the factory parking lot beside his truck, one shoe untied, unable to lift his left arm. Daniel survived. He understood conversations and could make decisions, but forming words took effort. Fatigue made it worse. Claire became interim president while I handled Daniel's rehabilitation, medication, and the changes needed at home. Within 3 weeks, my company password stopped working. Claire called it a security reset. Then my keycard failed. Access is limited to active executives, she told me. I am an active executive. You've been away. My husband had a stroke. I know. I've been covering for you. She said it gently. Claire's most effective sentences always sounded reasonable to outsiders. 2 days later, I received a letter saying the company was reviewing suspicious payments connected to me. Claire came to the house carrying soup. She put it in the refrigerator and told me the review was routine. Then why did a lawyer contact me? Because you have claims against Dad's company. I put money into the company. That is what you say. The records are signed. Dad signed whatever you put in front of him. Daniel sat in the next room doing speech exercises. You attended the meeting when the money went in, I said. I was 26. Dad said it was normal financing. He lied. Her expression tightened. Be careful. With what? With rewriting him while he can't defend himself. I turned toward Daniel. Tell her where the money came from. He reached for the dry erase board used during therapy and began writing slowly. House money. Laura Claire took the board before he could add anything. You see, she said. He remembers money connected to the house and Laura. Daniel made a frustrated sound. I knew what he meant. The house money came from Laura. Claire saw what she expected to see. A week later, she emailed senior employees, saying I had stepped away while the company investigated financial irregularities. Miguel called immediately. What irregularities? I don't know yet. That doesn't sound right. No. But Claire controlled the office, the records, and the public story. I had one old agreement and little else. For years, I trusted the factory to preserve the important documents. That was my mistake. I argued with Claire through email for several days. Each response became another piece of evidence against me. When I wrote that I would not allow the company to be sold until it addressed what it owed, she told Evan I was threatening to hold the factory hostage. He called me from his car. Are you trying to stop the company from operating? Did Claire show you the actual records? She said you refused to provide proof. The proof is inside the building she locked me out of. He was quiet. Did Dad know about the money? Yes. That's not the answer I wanted. After the call, I sat in my car outside a grocery store and watched people return carts in the rain. For the first time, I questioned my own memory. Maybe some payments had been counted as repayment. Maybe Daniel had changed the agreement. Maybe years of putting myself last had made me careless. When I returned home, Daniel was asleep in the recliner. A yellow legal pad rested beside him. 3 words were written across it. Claire plans sale. I read them twice. Then I stopped arguing. I began looking for records. Ruth asked me to meet her at a diner near the interstate. She chose a booth facing the door and ordered coffee she never touched. "I need to know whether you removed company files," she said. "No." "Did company money go into your account?" "Only reimbursements. I paid some bills myself during the crisis." "How much?" "I don't remember every amount." "That is not helpful." "I know." Ruth opened a small notebook. She was not there to reassure me. That was one reason I trusted her. "Claire says the company paid you more than $200,000. It didn't. There are transfers with your name. I need to see them." "She has restricted access." "You're the accountant." "I am the accountant as long as I follow instructions." Ruth glanced through the diner window. "I'm being told to prepare numbers for a buyer that pretend the company owes you nothing. They're wrong. I know the salary part is wrong." "How?" "Because I wrote deferred beside your name every Friday for 8 years." For the first time in weeks, I felt solid ground beneath me. After dinner, Ruth drove me to the factory. She used her own keycard and recorded our entry. The payroll archive was a narrow room behind accounting, lined with metal shelves and old red books. Ruth pulled one ledger down and opened it beneath the fluorescent light. My name appeared halfway down the page. Authorized salary. No check number. No deposit. Beside it, in Ruth's handwriting, deferred by agreement. She turned another page, then another. The same entry appeared every week. I reached toward the book. Ruth closed it. "Not yet. I need a copy." "You need a copy obtained properly. If Claire can say we took records without permission, she'll make that the story instead." She returned the ledger to the shelf. "Requested in writing tomorrow." I did. Ruth also showed me one payment Claire claimed had gone to me. It had my name beside it, but I remembered the transaction. During the crisis, a lender had threatened to take several machines. I had personally guaranteed the payment that kept them in the factory. The money had passed through an account connected to my name, then gone straight to the equipment company. A bank employee confirmed it 3 days later. Not $1 had reached me. The payment Claire described as proof that I had taken money was actually proof that I had saved the machines her father needed to stay open. Then Ruth found something worse. She called me from her car after work. "The buyer has a paper signed by you." "What paper?" "It says you gave up the money, the unpaid salary, and any right to object to the sale." I stopped in the middle of a pharmacy aisle. "I never signed that." "It looks like your signature." "When is it dated?" "February 17th. On February 17th, I had spent nearly 12 hours at Daniel's rehabilitation hospital. I had not gone to the factory. I had not met a lawyer. I had signed nothing. Helen Porter, a retired company attorney who still advised the Whitakers, asked the buyer to send her the page. The signature was mine. But it had been lifted from an old insurance form. Someone had attached it to a new document and treated it as permission. An email showed that Claire had been warned the signature came from an older page. Her response was brief. "Dad said the family claims were settled. Proceed. We can't delay the sale over paperwork." She had not copied my signature herself. She had simply chosen not to ask why it was attached to a document I had never seen. When I showed the email to Daniel, he pointed toward the phone. "Ruth," he said. I placed the call on speaker. Ruth answered after 2 rings. Daniel struggled for several seconds. "Ledger," he managed. Then, "Laura, ledger. I have them," Ruth said. "They're safe." His shoulders lowered. It did not repair what he had done before the stroke, but it showed he understood what Claire was trying to erase. The missing page about Claire and Evan's ownership appeared next. Ruth found an old message from Daniel, telling her not to send the children the full version of the agreement. He had written, "They do not need the details of Laura's contribution. I'll explain when things settle down." I placed the message in front of him at our dining table. "You wrote this." He read it. "Yes." "Why didn't you tell them?" He looked toward the kitchen. "Hard." "No. Hard was selling my house. This was embarrassing." He flinched. "Claire. Proud. Of you." He nodded. "And you wanted to keep it that way. Temporary." "Temporary lasted 9 years." Daniel pushed his chair back and walked away. That evening, Evan came to the house. I showed him the bank confirmation, the payroll pages, the false waiver, and the page proving I had protected his shares. When he understood what he was reading, he covered his mouth. "You could have taken control of the company." "Yes, but you didn't." "No." "Why?" "Because those shares came from your mother." He placed the page carefully on the table. Claire says you're stopping the sale because you want the company. I'm stopping it because the buyer plans to move most of the factory jobs out of Hickory. She said the jobs were safe. She didn't show you the whole plan. Evan stared at me. Most of the employees had not been told either. The buyer intended to keep the Whitaker name and showroom while moving finishing and upholstery somewhere cheaper. To Claire, the company would survive. To the people on the production floor, it would disappear beneath the same sign. 4 days before the banquet, Helen called me. I found one more message from Daniel. We met in her office. The email had been written 2 years after I sold my house. Helen had asked Daniel why Claire and Evan still did not know what I had done. Daniel replied, "The story has settled in a useful place. Claire believes I arranged the financing. Laura knows the truth and isn't asking for recognition. Correcting it now would create pain without changing the result." I read the sentence twice. The story had settled in a useful place. At first, Daniel hid the truth because he was ashamed. Later, he kept hiding it because the lie benefited him. My silence protected his reputation and preserved the version of him his children wanted to believe. Helen showed me one final detail. Claire would receive a large bonus if the sale closed, without my claims attached to the company. The sale was not only about money. Claire truly believed she was protecting her father's legacy. But if I disappeared from the financial story, she would also be paid for making me disappear. That was why Ruth brought the payroll ledgers to the banquet. That was why Miguel asked the workers to remain after dinner. And that was why I sat quietly while Claire called me a gold digger in front of everyone whose paychecks my house had once protected. After Ruth opened the first ledger, Claire set down her glass. "This is a retirement dinner," she said, "not an accounting meeting." Helen rose from a table near the stage. "It became more than a dinner when you announced the sale." Claire looked at Ruth. "Those records are private. They're payroll records," Ruth said. "And the people whose jobs are being discussed deserve the truth." Miguel stepped closer. "Read the entry." Ruth adjusted her glasses. "Laura Whitaker. Salary authorized. Payment deferred by agreement." Her finger moved down the page. The same entry appeared week after week. Claire folded her arms. "No one disputes that Laura helped in the office. The question is whether she was already paid." Helen motioned for me to join the table near the stage. I carried one folder. Claire watched me sit. "You planned this." I asked for the records to be reviewed. "You dragged employees into a family dispute. You announced their jobs were safe." Miguel looked at Claire. "Are they?" Claire hesitated. "The buyer will keep the Whitaker name and maintain operations during the transition." "That wasn't my question." The factory workers remained still. Claire finally said, "Some production may move after 18 months. A man from the finishing crew removed his glasses and cleaned them with his napkin. Ruth confirmed that the company still owed me money, and that the payment Claire had blamed on me went to save factory equipment. Helen handed Claire the bank confirmation. Claire looked toward Daniel. "Dad, you told me those payments settled her claims." Daniel gripped the wheelchair arm. "No." One syllable. Claire stepped away from the podium. "You said it was handled." He shook his head. Helen then placed the closing record from my bungalow on the table. Claire stared at the address. "You sold that house?" "Yes." "When?" "The week before the factory made payroll." She turned to Daniel. "You told us the money came from a bank." Daniel closed his eyes. Claire's confidence cracked, but she did not let go of it. "That proves she gave the company money. It doesn't prove she expected nothing in return." "I expected the company to repay me," I said. "And if it didn't, you could take our shares." Helen slid the missing page toward her. "No, Laura refused that right." Claire read it. Her eyes returned to the first line. "You could have taken control. I chose not to." "Why?" "Because those shares came from your mother." The microphone was still on. My answer reached the back wall. For a moment, Claire said nothing. Then she looked at me. "You still hid it." "I did." "You watched me believe Dad saved the company alone." "I did." "You let me build my career around that story. I should have corrected you long before tonight." "Then don't sit there pretending you had no part in this." "I'm not." The answer seemed to interrupt the argument she had prepared. I continued. "I stayed silent. But I never used that silence to take something from you. You're using it now. To stop a sale built on a false story. You're humiliating me. You chose the microphone." Claire turned toward Helen. "My father was protecting the company. Whatever he wrote, he was trying to keep the family together." Helen handed her Daniel's email. Claire read it. Her eyes stopped at the sentence about the story settling in a useful place. That could mean anything. She looked toward Daniel. You were protecting us, weren't you? His lips moved. Nothing came. Claire held the page higher. You didn't invent everything I believed. Tell them. Daniel reached for the legal pad beside him. His hand shook as he wrote. Evan held up the page when he finished. My lie. Claire stared at it. Daniel wrote again. Ashamed. Used her quiet. The showroom remained still. Claire looked down at the email, then at the missing page, then at the ledger. She had not surrendered yet. She turned back to me. You could have told me. Yes. You could have stopped this years ago. Yes. So why is everyone treating you like the only victim? I am not the only person who made a mistake. That slowed her. But when you were warned that my signature came from another document, you chose to proceed. Helen placed the false waiver on the screen behind Claire. Then she showed the email beneath it. We can't delay the sale over paperwork. Claire stared at her own words. It was a clerical issue. It was Laura's name, Helen said. I relied on Dad. Daniel pulled the legal pad back toward him. This time, he wrote only 4 words. I never saw it. Claire's voice sharpened. You told me the claims were resolved. Daniel shook his head. The buyer's lawyers reviewed it, Claire said. Other people saw the page. Other people asked you to confirm it, Helen replied. You told them not to delay. Claire gripped the podium. I was trying to save the company. Miguel spoke from beside the ledgers. By moving our jobs, the company has to change. Then say that, he replied. Don't call it protecting us. Claire looked toward the workers. No one shouted at her. No one needed to. She turned back to me. I thought I was protecting what Mom left us. You were protecting the version where you never had to ask who paid to keep it. Her mouth opened, then closed. Helen placed the document showing Claire's bonus beside the waiver. Claire looked down at the amount. You were going to be paid if my claims disappeared, I said. The bonus was for completing the sale. I know. I didn't invent the agreement. No, you just stopped checking once the agreement rewarded what you already believed. Claire turned toward the buyer's representative. He closed the folder in front of him. We were told Laura's claims were false, he said. We were not told the signature came from an older form. Claire looked back at Daniel. Tell them you said it was handled. Daniel's face tightened with effort. I lied. Before. Claire leaned closer. What? Not this. Her shoulders lowered slightly. Still, she remained standing. I believed you, she said. Daniel looked at her. He was my father, Claire said, turning toward me. I know. You knew he was lying and let me believe him. I know. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. So why are they believing you now? Because I brought them something they could verify. I didn't ask them to choose which woman they liked more. That was when Claire sat down. Not because she had forgiven me, not because she accepted everything at once. She sat because every defense she raised had led back to a page, a date, or a decision carrying her own name. Helen removed her glasses. The sale cannot move forward. Claire's voice sounded smaller when she asked, What happens now? The company reviews the real debt, the false waiver, and what employees were told. Claire turned toward Daniel. You gave me authority to handle this. Daniel looked back at her. Then he said the longest sentence he managed that evening. I trusted you to ask. The banquet ended without a toast. Employees left in small groups. Miguel carried the ledgers back to accounting. Ruth packed her copies into the canvas bag. I drove home alone. The buyer withdrew within 2 weeks. Once the real debt and the plan to move jobs were clear, the deal no longer looked as simple as Claire had promised. There was no police officer, public arrest, or instant collapse. The consequences came through quieter decisions. Claire was removed from control of the company. An independent review found that she had approved the use of my signature after being warned it belonged to another document. It also found that she had hidden how many jobs would leave Hickory and failed to tell the family how much she would personally receive from the sale. She had not forged the page herself. She had not stolen money. She had believed the version that benefited her, then stopped asking questions. Daniel resigned. He signed a public statement, correcting the company's history, and acknowledging that my house money and unpaid work had kept Whitaker Furniture alive. The factory could not repay everything immediately, without creating another crisis. I did not force it to. We agreed on a long repayment plan. I added one condition. The employees would receive part ownership of the company, and any future attempt to move production would have to be presented to them honestly. Claire called it punishment. It reduces what Mom left us. It reduces your ability to sell what other people kept alive. This company is our family legacy. It is also their livelihood. She folded the same sheet of paper twice, pressing the crease with her thumbnail. What do you want from me? Nothing tonight. You stopped the sale. Dad is stepping down. I lost my position. What else is there? You still think consequences are things someone gives you? She had no answer. Evan returned to design under an outside manager. Daniel moved into a rehabilitation apartment closer to his therapy center. That was my decision. He wanted to come home. I could not live beside him while every room reminded me of conversations he delayed until they became lies. He began writing letters, because writing was easier than speaking. The first was 6 pages. I read 1. Then I placed the rest in a drawer. Daniel apologized for accepting credit, hiding the truth, and treating my silence as permanent permission. He also wrote that he had always loved me. I believed him. That was part of the problem. Love had existed beside the betrayal. One did not erase the other. Sometimes love is real, and still not enough to make someone brave. Claire came to my house a month after the banquet. She did not bring soup. She stood on the porch, holding a file box filled with the shortened records Daniel had sent her over the years. She had compared them with the originals. He left things out more than once, she said. Yes. I thought it happened once. It didn't. She stared at the box. I should have asked you. You should have. Her eyes lifted. Can I come in? Not today. She nodded. Before leaving, she placed the box beside the door. I called you that in front of everyone. I remember. I knew I would receive more money if your claims disappeared. I know. I told myself it didn't matter because your claims were false. That was convenient. Her mouth tightened. I don't expect you to forgive me. That is the first realistic thing you've said. She gave a small, painful laugh and walked back to her car. I did not call her back. A year after the banquet, the factory was still open. Finishing stayed in Hickory. So did upholstery. The workers owned part of the company now. Ruth retired on her own terms. At her farewell lunch, Miguel presented her with one of the red payroll ledgers mounted inside a glass case. She refused to take it home. That belongs here, she said. The ledger went into the showroom display. The new plaque did not call anyone a hero. It listed the managers and workers who had carried the factory through the crisis. My name appeared among them. The same size as everyone else's. That was enough. Evan stayed in design. Claire spent nearly a year away from the company. When she returned, she worked in sales under a manager who was not related to her. At her first employee meeting, Miguel asked 3 questions about a new retail proposal. Claire answered 2. On the third, she admitted she needed to check the numbers. Miguel later told me it was the most useful thing he had ever heard her say. Daniel and I did not resume living together. We met for lunch twice a month. His speech improved. So did his ability to remain present when a conversation became uncomfortable. Eventually, he stopped asking when I would come home and began asking whether there was anything he could repair. The answer changed depending on the day. Some things yes, some things no. I used the first company repayment as a down payment on another bungalow. It was smaller than the house I sold. The kitchen cabinets had been painted a dull gray that made the room look tired. One Saturday, I began sanding them. Halfway through the first cabinet, Claire arrived wearing work gloves and carrying sandwiches in a paper bag. She did not walk straight inside. She waited at the end of the driveway until I waved her forward. We worked for 3 hours without discussing the banquet. At one point, she opened the wrong can and covered half a cabinet door with primer meant for metal. She stared at it. I laughed before I could stop myself. Claire looked at me, uncertain. Then she laughed too. It did not repair the past. It did not make her my daughter, or me her mother. It was one Saturday. That was all I was willing to call it. For years I believed love meant protecting people from the full cost of the truth. I protected Daniel from shame. I protected Claire and Evan from seeing their father fail. I protected the workers from instability. What I failed to protect was my own place in the story. Silence did not make me generous forever. Eventually, it made everyone else careless with me. The old payroll ledgers recorded what the company owed. They could not record the house I gave up, the nights I worked, or the number of times I let Daniel accept praise because correcting him felt cruel. But they recorded enough. A date, a signature, a line no one thought to erase. This time, my name stayed in the book. If you have ever been written out of something you helped build, tell me what you would have done, and subscribe for more stories about the quiet choices that finally bring the truth into the open.